Okay, today we are leaving finally after a long stay of 4 weeks. We're finally leaving topic 2, the time value of money. Now, I think I mentioned to you in the early going that we spend so much time on topic 2, time value of money, because it is the heart and soul of finance, really. And unless you have a thoroughgoing and comfortable understanding of time value of money, you won't find much else of use in finance, and it'll be befuddling to you, complicated and mysterious. So I hope that you've learned a lot about the time value of money by now. If you haven't, I don't know how to further help you. I've done about all I can do, and I will tell you I've spent far more time on it than most people who teach finance do. They seem to think that students should just be able to pick it up right away and go run with it. My experience tells me that's not the case. My experience tells me that frequently people don't really ever quite get it, and then all the rest that we do is meaningless, turns out. So I hope for you it is not, because everything we do from this point on is finally going to touch on the time value of money again. So here we are beginning topic 3 today, and as is my custom today, I will give you an overview of what we're going to be doing. There is a topic 3 workbook, but as you can see, that workbook is not due until we come back from break. So you will find, though, that it is generally a good idea to get started on the quiz and the workbook simultaneously. They will inform each other. They will help you understand each other if you start dabbling in the workbook right away. Valuing bonds. Well, what does that mean? When we talk about assets, financial assets, bonds are a major category of financial assets. Name another major category of financial assets. Stocks, of course. So we have stocks. An even broader category in which stocks fall is equities. It's called equities, right? Bonds are not equities because they're debt instruments, right? If a company sells a bond, what's it really doing? Borrowing money. It owes the money back, and when somebody wants to use your money, what do they have to do? They have to pay interest. What is interest? It is the rental price of using someone else's money. That is the best way for you to think about what interest is. Interest is the rental price. You're renting someone else's money. You don't get to keep it. It's not yours. You don't own it. You're renting it. It's just like your apartment. You pay rent on it. You use someone else's money under contract. It's called interest. Okay, so on slide -2, here are some real-world questions that you'll want to be able to answer by the time you get finished reading chapter 6. What do all those numbers about bonds in the Wall Street Journal mean? You may never have seen the Wall Street Journal. I don't know. If you have seen a paper copy of the Wall Street Journal, these days I don't mess around with paper copies of hardly anything, least of all the Wall Street Journal. I read it online. But if you have the paper version, there will be a page where it has a gazillion bonds listed and columns of numbers about them. Well, in this chapter, you will learn how to read those numbers and what they mean. My company is going to sell $300 million in a new bond issue. What coupon rate will we need to offer to ensure that investors will buy those bonds? There's a real-world question. For a company that wants to raise $300 million of capital, doing so by borrowing it, they're going to have to issue bonds and offer a coupon rate. What does that mean? Well, you're going to know what that means shortly, if you don't already. Why do the prices of seasoned bonds go up and down all the time? And they do. A seasoned bond is simply a bond that has been issued before and is out there for sale in the market. So it's not a new issued bond. It is a seasoned bond. Well, if you look in the Wall Street Journal again from one day to the next, the price of, let's say, IBM 10-year bonds maturing at some date 10 years from now, it'll actually be less than 10 years, won't it? Because it's a seasoned bond. Might be due The maturity date might be just 2 years from now. It might be a 10-year maturity bond with 2 years remaining in its maturity. Well, the price of that bond, what you could purchase it for today, will be different from what you might be able to purchase it for tomorrow. Why? What causes the prices of bonds to go up and down on a daily basis? Are bonds as risky as stocks? Most people would say no, and I guess that makes sense in a certain context, but please don't imagine that bonds are without risk. They are considerably risky, but they probably aren't as risky as stocks. Why not? Well, we'll talk about that and see if we can understand why they might not be as risky as stocks. So, a share of stock for Microsoft has some risk attached with that we might be able to measure, or we might not be able to measure that. We'll come to that later in this course, whether or not we can measure risk in a useful way. But whatever risk a stock of Microsoft has, a bond issued by Microsoft is less risky. Why? We'll need to understand that. On 5-3, here are the key learning objectives for this chapter. We want to know all about the terminology of bonds so that when somebody uses that terminology, we don't stand there with a stupid look on our face. We actually understand what they said, right? We want to understand the definitions in particular of coupon rate, current yield, and yield to maturity. We'll not just understand them, we'll calculate them, which will help us understand them. We want to be able to compute the market price of a bond given that its yield to maturity is known. If somebody says, well, here's a bond, here's its yield to maturity, we want to be able to calculate the theoretical price of the bond. Now, I will hasten to add that this course is called what? Theory of Finance. So what we're learning about is theory of financial valuation here, of a particular kind of asset. Will a bond always have its theoretical correct price? The answer is no. Not according to what we're going to learn. We're going to learn what its price should be in the absence of other factors that could cause it to be different. Okay, we're going to learn what that means. And in particular, the thing that we're going to ignore right now is risk. We're just going to pretend that a bond doesn't have any risk, that it is just what it says it is, that it's a contract to use someone else's money and that there's going to be no defaults and all the interest payments are going to be made. Well, under those conditions, the value of the bond can be known with certainty. That's assuming away, though, all the real world, isn't it? Okay? So that's why we...
Often that bonds are defaulted on?
Come again?
Is it often bonds are defaulted?
Oh, all the time.
Really?
Oh, sure.
Wait.
Much more than you would think.
I never really heard about that. Because bonds,
yeah.
That's what they sell at the bank, too, isn't it?
Well, a bond, if you...
18-month bond or 12-month bond?
Those are CDs.
Oh, okay.
Certificates of deposit that you can buy at a bank are insured by the FDIC if they're below, if they're $100,000 or less. And so they don't carry default risk. Right? But if you go to, you can go online. Of course, anybody that doesn't use low-cost online trading these days just doesn't like money, I guess, because you can save so much by just using something like Scottrade, which is what I use. They're, of course, not the only low-cost online broker, but they are the best, in my opinion. Others could say something else, but if you go to a full-service broker or an online broker and buy a bond, you're buying a bond for either the United States government or a company or a municipality other than the United States government, maybe a state, maybe a city, whatever. Those bonds can and do default. The only ones that don't default are Treasury securities. They never default. Why? Because, well, the United States Treasury, with the help of the Fed, can create money. That's why it's impossible for them to default. So here's your money, right? Where'd that come from? But don't ask. Here's your money, right? It literally is. So, but the state of Virginia can't do that. The state of California can't print money. And so they can conceivably default on their bonds. Certainly companies can and do default on their bonds. Now they typically don't stay in business when they do that, but they do. Okay, so understand why those prices. Now the fifth item on slide 5-3 is we want to be able to understand why the prices of seasoned bonds, that means bonds that have already been issued and they're out there in the marketplace available for sale. Or they might not be available for sale. They might be in your hip pocket. It doesn't matter where they are. They vary. Those prices vary. The market prices of bonds vary inversely with market yields of whatever competing bonds of the same quality are yielding. We're going to want to come to grips with this term yield. Okay, what does the word yield mean? You're going to want to understand that's part of the terminology of bonds. Is that different from saying the rate of return? Is that different from saying the coupon rate? What does it mean when we say yield? We'll understand that. And we want to understand at least a little bit about bond ratings. One of the attending circumstances of the financial problems that we began to experience in late 2007 and early 2008, sometimes called the financial markets meltdown, or sometimes called other names. Part of that had to do with the fact that there was a whole category of bonds that had been given AAA ratings by the rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch. And they now go by a different name. That different name is toxic assets, which you may have heard about. Toxic assets, right? Nobody wants them. But yet they were originally sold with AAA ratings, highest investment grade available. So we surely would like to understand something about bond ratings. And now we do have a greater understanding of bond ratings than we had before. We understand that Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch don't actually know what they're doing necessarily. That isn't to say they never know what they're doing. That is to say they got it really, really badly wrong with something called mortgage-backed securities, bonds issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Okay, here is Dr. K's whirlwind overview of Chapter 6. You get it once, that's all. It's not much, but you do get it. It'll help you as you prepare to read it. But what is a bond? It is a legal contract, a debt contract. And it is a financial instrument. So it's really a standardized contract. It's standardized in several ways. One way that a bond is standardized is practically every bond you'll ever meet has a face value of $1,000. So that's standard. If you saw a bond that was for $2,750, you'd say, "Why, that's very strange." They just don't happen that way, okay? It would be very strange because a bond is a standardized contract. It is a debt instrument, a financial instrument resulting from long-term debt of either a government or a business. You and I don't issue bonds. If you and I borrow money, we enter into a contract that is called a promissory note, or it's called a mortgage, it's called something else, it's not a bond. However, it is quite instructive to think about all kinds of debt as bonds because they have several features in common. The face value, also known as the par value of the bond, is typically $1,000. It's also called the maturity value of the bond. They would have all these different names: face value, par value, maturity value, all the same thing. Yes?
Do bonds always result from debt, or if I was just looking to expand my business?
Well, you do sell bonds to expand your business. What are you doing? You're borrowing somebody's money in $1,000 chunks. Okay. You're renting the use of someone else's money. So, that's typically what a business issues bonds for, to expand, to buy physical assets, capital assets, real assets, and plant and equipment, right? Or to finance an advertising campaign. They're selling bonds to raise capital, in a word. We use the word capital in finance. We don't mean it in the same way that economists typically use the word capital to mean plant and equipment. We use the word capital in finance to mean what? Money. It's money, for goodness sakes. Somebody might say, why don't they just use money? I guess they want to sound sophisticated or something. I don't know why. Yes?
The face value of a bond says it's like $1,000, right? So
It's just what it says written on the face, $1,000. If you actually had the physical bond.
So there's no $100,000 bond, it'd be like $101,000?
There could be, but there typically aren't because it's a standardized contract. So, yeah, if you bought $100,000 worth of bonds, you would have bought 100 bonds, typically. There's nothing that says a bond couldn't be $100,000. They just aren't. Why? Because by its very nature, they're intended to be a standardized contract. Come in units of 1,000.
Okay, so you can't break up. You can't buy a half.
No, you can't buy half a bond.
You can buy stocks, can't you?
Not really.
You can't. You have to.
No. Somebody has to buy the whole stock. They might sell you a fractional share. You might be able to buy fractional shares of stock through an investment company that's operating a mutual fund.
Okay.
You might be able to buy fractional shares in that sense. But somebody has to buy the whole stock and be the technical owner of it. Same thing with the bond. You can't buy half a bond. Somebody owns the whole bond. Okay. It does turn out, though, that lots of interesting things can be done and are done with bonds. United States Treasuries, for instance, can be sold stripped. Somebody can own the rights to the interest payments and someone can own the rights to the return of principal. They're called strips. Interesting, huh? You typically, just with treasuries, they don't usually strip other bonds, not usually. But treasuries are special category bonds because they don't have any default risk. So that's just the face value. So that's one of the features of the standardized contract of debt instruments. Bonds have three basic yields. Now I've put in parentheses on slide 5-4, rate of return. Well, what does a yield mean? Let's start to warm up to this word yield. Well, the first thing that a yield is it is a rate of return. So it's like an interest rate of sorts, but it doesn't mean exactly the same thing as an interest rate, but it kind of does. What does the word yield mean? Well, for me, when I think of the word yield, I think of money coming at me. This instrument's yielding some money. It's giving it up, okay? It's coming to me, all right? An interest rate could just be a rate, right? An interest rate is a price, isn't it? What kind of price? Well, it's the rental price of using someone else's money. Can the yield be different than the rental price of using someone else's money? Answer, yes. But not entirely, because it depends on the frame of reference you're talking about. Yield, though, for me, means some money's coming my way if I'm the owner of that yield. You can have an investment that is a good investment that's yielding nothing, can't you? What would that mean?
Someone's going to reinvest it?
Could be. It could be that there's just no money coming yet. That it's a long-term investment and there just isn't any return yet. Right? So there's no yield. I mean, I might own a piece of property, for example. I might own some real estate, say, some land out in the countryside. Does it have a yield? No. No money coming. In fact, I have to pay taxes on it. There's a negative yield, as it were. Money's going away from me. But that's an asset, right? But some financial assets have a yield, some don't have a yield. It's kind of a funny word, but it's a word that gets used with bonds. So we do have something called the coupon rate. That's one of the three basic yields or rates of return that attach to a bond. The second one's called current yield. That has a definition, which we'll see momentarily. And then we have the third category, the third basic yield is called yield to maturity. All right? Obviously, the term yield to maturity evokes a thought, doesn't it? Sort of evokes, doesn't it? Well, what kind of rate of return would I have if I held this thing till it matured? Do people hold bonds until they mature? Sometimes. Most usually, though, they don't. Why? Well, because a lot of bonds are like 10-year maturity bonds or 20-year maturity bonds. or 5-year maturity bonds. What if you buy a 10-year maturity bond? So you plunk down $1,000. It's newly issued bond. It costs $1,000. All right? And let's suppose that its coupon rate is 10%. We're going to find out what that means in a minute. Well, it's a 10-year maturity bond. 2 years later, you might decide, you know what? I really need to go to Cancun and have a wild party. I'm going to sell this bond. It's not matured yet. So you sell it. Now you haven't held it to maturity, have you? All right? But you might have earned some return on it. Nonetheless, while you owned it, we're going to see how these things fit together.
Wait. So is there a difference between yield to maturity and rate of return for that period?
We'll see.
Okay.
Barclay says, is there a difference between a rate of return and the yield to maturity for, quote, that period? We'll have to see what that period is and refine our question a little bit more. All right, so a bond is a legal contract. On 5-5, here is the definition of these three different types of yields or rates of return. The coupon rate is the easiest one. You simply take what's called the coupon and you divide it by the face value of the bond. Now, what in the world is a coupon? Well, the coupon is the payment of interest periodically that this contract, this debt instrument promises to pay. The word coupon comes from the fact that in the old days, when bonds were physically pieces of paper, and they had these nice filigreed edges, and they usually had a picture of an eagle or something on them, and wallpaper in the background, and maybe it looked very formal. And well, they had these coupons at the bottom that you could tear off, like perforated coupons. You tear it off, you mail it in to the company, and they would send you back the coupon payment. All right, so it came to be called the coupon. So here you might have bought a $1,000 bond, matures in 10 years, and the coupon, typically bonds have semi-annual coupon payments. So they have 2 coupons paid a year, and so maybe the coupon was $20. So what could you do if you happened to find one of these coupons laying around on the ground? You could mail it in and they would send you $20. And so that's the coupon, right? So the coupon is part of the contract. It's part of the standardized contract relationship between the issuer of a bond and the buyer of a bond. The issuer of the bond is saying, we promise to do this. Here's what this contract says. We promise to pay you 20 coupons of $20 each, 2 coupons per year for the next 10 years. And then when the final coupon is paid, we'll also send you back $2,000. Simple contract, right? Well, if you took the coupon, which in my example was $20, you have to take it times 2 to get the annual coupon, don't you? So that'd be $40. If you divide $40 by 1,000, what do you get? The answer is the coupon rate. And that would be 4%, wouldn't it? So if you had such a bond, it would have a 4% coupon rate. In actual terminology, the way it gets used in Wall Street and among financial operatives, they speak of the coupon, and when they speak of the coupon, they mean the 4%. They just leave off the word rate. Technically speaking, that isn't the coupon. The coupon is the actual money that gets paid by the company that's borrowing the money. But they're a little sloppy with their language, but over time, that's just the way it's become. They speak of the coupon. So what's the coupon? 7%. Technically, they should have said, what's the coupon rate? Now, the current yield is a different thing. The current yield, by definition, is the coupon, which we just learned what that is. That's the amount of money that the company sends whoever owns the bond.
Per year.
Per year, really. Although when we do technical calculations, we'll have to take account of the semi-annual nature of the payments. Of course, we've learned how to do that. What then, let's see if you got anything out of the last 4 weeks. A bond evidently is what kind of financial instrument, what kind of calculation will be involved with a bond, and an annuity. Why? Because it promises to pay a fixed payment with a fixed periodicity for a fixed number of periods. Well, I'll be damned, that's an annuity. Right. Okay, so we already know more about bonds than we thought we knew, because we already know about annuities, don't we? All right, good. So if you take the coupon, say the annual coupon, which is the semi-annual multiplied times 2, and divide it by the bond's current market price, aha, we're not dividing by the face value, we're dividing by the market price that this bond is being bought and sold for. That's called the current yield. And that makes some sense, doesn't it? Here you go down, if you buy a newly issued bond, maybe its face value is the same thing as its market price, and typically that is the case. But say you buy a 10-year bond 2 years down the road, will its market price be $1,000? Answer, not likely. Things will have happened. We're going to study what things happen and why those bond prices change, indeed. But whatever the market price is, you might go and say, well, I've got this bond, I paid $1,000 for it, it's a 10-year maturity bond, I've owned it for 2 years now, I want to sell it and go have a wild party in Cancun, and you go to the marketplace and lo and behold, the market price of your bond is $890. You're able to sell it for $890. Take it or leave it, buddy.
Wouldn't they typically go up, though, since the maturity?
Would they typically go up? That depends. We'll see.
But you get what I'm saying, because the maturity is going down.
Well, yes, you're getting closer to maturity. It doesn't have to change at all. It could be that the market price remains $1,000 all the way through the life of the bond. That's possible. It's unlikely, but it's possible. So it doesn't have to go up or down. It depends on where it is. If the price of the bond has dropped below the face value, then it surely must be the case as time ticks by, the market price must start, other things unchanged, must rise. Why? Well, because when this bond reaches maturity, it will have a market price of what? The face value. Here we are. We're standing here the day before maturity. I've got a promise to pay from Microsoft that says $1,000 on it. I'll sell it to you. What would you be willing to pay for it?
Less than $1,000.
You might be willing to pay less than $1,000. What will I be willing to sell it for? I only have to wait one day and it's worth $1,000, so don't get too low.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe $999.75. Maybe I'll take that just because I want the money right now. All right? But I only have to wait one day, and then what's it worth? $1,000. I'm going to get $1,000. So you're right in your observation that other things unchanged. If the price of the bond in the market was below the face value, as we move toward maturity, it surely must rise toward the face value. Other things unchanged. But a lot of other things might not be unchanged. For example, the CEO of the company that issued the bond might get put in jail. Right? That happened with Enron, maybe. Well, I don't know if it actually happened with Enron, but when bad news about a company comes out, what do you suppose happens to the prices of their bonds? Down they go. The demand for those bonds goes down, so the market price of those bonds gets bid down. Guess what that would do to the current yield of the bond? Cause it to rise. If the price of a bond gets beaten down in the marketplace, what's happening to its current yield? The coupon is fixed, so it must be rising. Aha! Okay, file that away. All right. Then we come to this most complicated idea. It is complicated because it depends on some things that we haven't yet learned about in the theory of finance, but we will learn about later. The yield to maturity. What is that? It is the internal rate of return. You say, oh God, he's already said something I don't know. What the hell's that? The internal rate of return. Well, it is the internal rate of return based on the bond's price, its face value, and its coupon, assuming that the bond is held to maturity and assuming that as they are paid, the coupons are reinvested at the same internal rate of return such that you would get a compound rate of interest. Well, that's pretty complicated sounding, and of course that doesn't actually happen. When you get paid that $20 coupon, what do you probably do? Well, you go buy some cheeseburgers with it, right? You probably don't reinvest it at the same rate of return. Right? So this is a little bit complicated, particularly because we haven't studied the internal rate of return. However, we did do a workbook problem where you use the brute force method to calculate the situation's internal rate of return. Do you remember it? You had to plug in different interest rates, right? You plugged in different discount rates until you got the present value to what it was supposed to be. What you had just done is solved for what amounts to the yield to maturity on a bond. And you did it by brute force, just trial and error, right? Setting the thing up so that you knew when you got it right. Well, that is the internal rate of return. The bond has an internal rate of return. What does that mean? Well, here is an asset. You paid something for it, right? So you go out and buy it. That's the market price of what you just invested, right? Now that asset has a series of cash flows attached to it, doesn't it? And they come in the future. Those cash flows come. But they come periodically because it's an annuity, isn't it? And when you get your annuity payments, what do you have to do to get compound return? You'd have to reinvest them, wouldn't you? Otherwise you're not getting any interest on interest. Well, under those conditions where you are able to do that, if you were able to do that, as you got paid your annuity payments, you immediately didn't spend them on cheeseburgers. You reinvested them in another bond that had the same yield to maturity, or some other asset that had the same internal rate of return. Then that whole series of cash flows associated with that bond, by the time you have held the bond completely to maturity and get paid back the face value, you will have some yield, won't you? And whatever that compound yield would calculate out to, it's called the yield to maturity. All right, this sounds very confusing right now. Actually, when we do some workbook examples, it'll all click in. Yes, Barkley.
Yeah, when you talk about the yield to maturity, does that include the coupon or not?
Yes, it includes the coupons.
Okay, so...
But it more than includes them. It assumes you reinvest them at the same yield to maturity.
I think I understand it a little bit. So with your example of the $1,000 base, whatever, $40 a year, that'd be $1,400 if you didn't reinvest. So you know if you reinvested that the yield to maturity is greater than $400, right?
Well, let's back up. A yield is going to be expressed as a percentage, because it's like an interest rate, all right? So here come these coupon payments. It's a 10-year bond, right? First year passes. Actually, you get two, right? You get a $20 one, and then you get another $21 6 months later. To calculate the yield to maturity, you have to take that first $20 and be able to reinvest it at the same yield.
More than 20 in 6 months.
Indeed. So, but let's imagine we had a bond that just had annual coupons. So, and there's nothing that says you couldn't, it's just that that's not usually what they do. So now we get our $40. We go reinvest it somewhere. Maybe go down to the bank and put it in a checking account, a savings account that happens to pay the same yield that this bond does. Unlikely, but suppose you could do that. Every year for the next 9 years, you get an additional $40 and you do the same thing with them. And then finally, at the end of 10 years, they send you your $1,000 back. Now, what will you have collected? And you will have collected it over time. You didn't get it all at once. You'll have collected 10 $40 payments, right, spread out over time as an annuity. And then you get a lump sum payment of $1,000 back. What did you pay for the bond? Well, you paid something for it. Whatever you paid for it, now we can calculate what your total yield to maturity was if you in fact held it to maturity. Okay? We'll see examples of this and it'll make much more sense when we actually calculate yield to maturity. All right? Just looking at it in words, when I look at these words, I look at them and it makes perfect sense. But I do remember looking at them at a time long ago where they made absolutely no sense at all. All right, so don't feel bad if you're in that category. On slide 5-6, since bonds represent ownership of a stream of future cash flows, the value of the bond is just going to be, the theoretical value of the bond is just going to be the present value of those future cash flows, isn't it? We've learned all about present value, haven't we? We have. We ought to be able to turn the present value every which way but loose by now. Good God, we spent 4 weeks on the damn stuff. If you don't understand it now, you might want to consider dropping this class. We really have put the time on it. I mean, present value is such an easy idea to me after all these years. I hope it is an easy idea to you. If it's not, you need to go revisit topic 2. You need to reread chapter 5. You need to rework workbook problems, because you simply have to understand that first bullet on slide 5-6, that since the bond represents ownership of a stream of future cash flows, those future cash flows today have a present value, don't they? If we have a known discount rate. Whatever that present value is, that is the theoretical value that this bond should have. And would have other things unchanged. Well, what other things are we insisting that we not change? Can't let the bond default, can't have any bad news about the bond. We're ignoring all the real-world possibilities that can and do happen with bonds. We're saying theoretically, what would be the present value of those future cash flows? Well, whatever it would be, that's what theoretically the bond's value is.
Okay, so the value of the bond it's the face value of it. Yeah.
Not today. Here I've got a 10-year bond that I bought 2 years ago. Its face value is still $1,000. That's part of the contractual relationship, right?
Yeah.
But what's its market price today? Surely not going to be $1,000. Why? Because $80 worth of coupons have already been paid, not going to be paid again. Right? They're no longer part of the future cash flow associated with this bond, are they? So it makes sense that the present value of this seasoned bond is no longer $1,000, even if it was what it was worth the day it was sold. Okay? So just remember, the present value of the cash flows promised by a bond are going to be theoretically calculable. We know how to do that. It's an annuity, isn't it? It's annuity plus a lump sum future value that must be discounted with return of principal at the end of maturity. So the PV of the cash flows promised by a bond will depend on the discount rate we use to calculate the present value, right? We've learned that. If we've got a set of future cash flows, the present value of those cash flows definitely depends on what discount rate we use. Well, what would be the appropriate discount rate to use if we wanted to calculate the theoretical value of the bond? The appropriate discount rate is the yield to maturity determined in the bond market through the offers to buy and sell bonds of similar characteristics. What kind of characteristics? Well, same face value, same maturity date, same risk level, blah, 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 right? Same characteristics that attach to the bond. So maturity, how much time left to maturity on the bond, how risky is the bond, its bond rating might help us be informed of that, the quality of the bond, and something called duration. Duration is a concept that we will not study in depth in this course. We do talk about and study duration in my investments analysis class. We will have a little bit to say about duration, but not much. Duration depends mostly on remaining term to maturity anyway. So it is different, but it is most simply thought about as having a lot to do with how much remains to maturity. It's not quite that simple, but for your purposes right now, you can think about it that way. So if I have a 10-year bond and 2 years have passed, both its remaining term to maturity has gone down. It's no longer 10 years, it's 8 years. And we will find that its duration, which is a calculation that can be made for a bond, will have gone down also. Okay? All right, so don't worry too much about duration, but that is one of the characteristics that we attach to a bond to tell us whether or not it's similar to another bond. On slide 5-7, the discount rate that causes the present value of a bond's future cash flows, including the return of principal, to equal its current market price is the yield to maturity. That is almost exactly what we did in that workbook problem, only we didn't use the word bond, right? We had an annuity, we had a series of cash flows, didn't we, that was coming our way, and we knew its present value, which would be the same thing as the current market price of the bond, right, if we're talking about a bond. And we were able to calculate the internal rate of return for that, and it's called, with a bond, it just has a name. It's called yield to maturity.
That was what my question was when I asked you that.
Okay.
The way I saw it was like, if you have the bond costs $1,000 and your promise is $1,000, you could make coupons that would be the right amounts for that, or you could have a bond with a future value that needs the coupons, and that's how much it should cost now. You get what I'm saying? Where I didn't. I
sort of see it, but
variable would be.
Yeah, here's what I want you to think about. We're calling it a bond, but just think of it as a magic box, if you want to. I don't care how you think of it. It's something that keeps spitting out these coupons every 6 months. And these pile of dollars falls out of the box, right, every 6 months. Okay. And it's always the same pile of dollars. $20 every 6 months, say. And that box has a market price. It's bought and sold every day, and you know what the market price is. And it happens that the box has written on one side $1,000, so that after you wait long enough, you can sell the box for $1,000.
Okay.
Now.
Yeah, that was my question. Is they try to make it $1,000 when the
bond is initially sold. When they initially sell the bond, they try very hard to get it to sell for $1,000.
Okay.
So it'll neither sell for a discount nor premium. In the real world, they typically are going to sell for within a few cents of $1,000 when they're newly issued. And what's going to make the difference? What's going to make the difference is what's going on in the market today for bonds like this bond. Right? What are their market prices? Because it must strike you as sensible that you're not going to be able to sell a new bond for a different price with the same characteristics as other bonds that are available. They're all going to sell for the same price, aren't they? Well, if it just happens that something, when they plan a bond issue, what they're going to do is the investment bankers are going to say, okay, so they work with investment bankers when they do a bond issue. You'll learn more about that if you take financial management, right? So the investment banker says, okay, well, at the time we're going to issue these bonds are going to hit the market. Here's what we think that the current yield of seasoned bonds is going to be to have the same quality as these bonds. Well, that's going to be the discount rate that people are going to apply. Current yield of other competing bonds, right? And so they're going to say, well, what do we have to make the coupon so that the sucker will sell for $1,000?
Okay.
Right?
And I made my question complicated. Basically, is the coupon based on the current market price? Is the current market price based on the coupon?
The answer is yes. They're both, right? So, okay, so that's another look at what we mean by the yield to maturity. So because the present values and discount rates on slide 5A7 must vary inversely by their very definitions, right? We've learned all that already in topic 2, haven't we? By the very definitions of what we mean by discount rate and present values, they always vary inversely. The market price of a bond and its yield to maturity always vary inversely. So what does that mean? Here we are. I've got a bond. It's been issued. Who cares when it was issued? Here it is now, and it's for sale in the marketplace. If its price gets bid up by people who'd like to own that bond, what happens to its yield to maturity? It's at the very same instant being bid down. It really is like looking at the heads and tails of the same coin. It's just one coin, right? You can't. Sometimes people get all balled up about this. Why does the yield to maturity rise when the price of the bond falls? Because of the way those things are defined. That's why. That's like saying, if I flip a coin and it comes up heads, why did the other side come up tails? It had to, right? It's really just two different ways of looking at the same phenomenon. When the market price of an asset gets bid down, if that asset has a fixed set of cash flows attached to it, then what's happening to the present value of that fixed set of cash flows? It's going up. That means its yield. It means its yield to maturity is going up. Sure. Okay. So some investors use bonds to speculate on the movement of market interest rates. How could you do that? Well, let's see. If you thought that market interest rates in general were going to rise, you would know that what's that going to do to bond prices?
Yeah.
Other things than change are going to go down. So what would you want to do? You'd want to sell bonds short, right? Sell them now at a higher price, and then when you actually have to deliver the goods, go buy them at the lower price. You've made money. If you're right about the direction of market interest rates. If you think market interest rates are going to fall, then you're right. What's going to happen to the market prices of bonds? They're going to rise. So what do? Buy bonds now, wait. Market rate of interest gets bid down. The market price of the bonds you bought gets bid up. You go sell them, you've made a capital gain. That's why I tell you that if you could ever figure out a way to forecast market interest rates, I know a way to get rich. Okay? But you better be right. Right? The easiest way in the world to get rich is to speculate on bonds, but you better be right. And the price changes can be dramatic. It turns out, as we'll learn in this chapter, the longer the term to maturity for a bond, the more dramatic is the relationship between the change in its price and a change in market rates of interest. And that's what duration has to do with a bond. Bonds that have high duration, what does that mean? That means that when the market rate of interest rises by 1 basis point, which is 1/100th of a percentage point, the market price rises by a factor of the duration times its current market price. So that duration is a key number to describe the characteristic of a bond. And there are several things that affect duration. One of them, the biggest one that affects, is how long is there remaining to maturity. So what happens is, if you want to speculate on bonds, what you do is you use long-term bonds that have a long time remaining to maturity. Because then, when interest rates in the marketplace move, the price of those long-term bonds changes dramatically. Short-term bonds, not so much. Right? You have just a bond that has 1 year remaining to maturity. How much is its price going to change when market rates of interest rate change? Not too much. This all has to do with time value of money calculations that we've already learned about. Okay, on slide 5-8, bonds carry interest rate risk. What does that mean? Well, because anything that would cause market rates of interest to change, like the Fed, for example, would cause the prices of seasoned bonds to change inversely, wouldn't they? Now you know part of the reason why I don't think much of the Fed. The Fed is able to manipulate not just interest rates, but the price of bonds. That means here I am sitting here with an asset that I thought was worth X. The Fed does something that's X minus Y now. Damn. That's not right. Is that right? Well, you decide. Got 7 old farts called the Federal Reserve Board who can manipulate interest rates and thereby manipulate the value of my financial assets. You like that idea? I never have. Never really liked that idea so much, especially since those 7 old farts have friends. Oh, really? Yeah, really. If I can get Timothy Geithner to tell me the right thing one day ahead of when you know it, I can make an assload of money. Did he say assload? He did. You think that doesn't happen? Dream on. Long-term bonds. By definition, those bonds that have 10 years to maturity or longer have greater interest rate risk than short-term bonds. Why? Because their duration is longer, which is a term you don't know how to calculate yet and probably won't know in this course. But it simply is going to mean that the price change of the bond is more dramatic when interest rates change. Zeros. What's a zero? Remember zeros? We did study a little bit about different kinds of financial instruments when we began this course, remember? A zero is a bond that has no coupon payments. That's like 90-day T-bills. 90-day T-bills are zeros. They don't have any coupon payments. How do 90-day T-bills work? Here's a 90-day T-bill. This is one of the strange bonds that has a different value than $1,000. T-bills have $10,000 face value. So here's a piece of paper that upon maturity you get $10,000. You pay 90 days ahead less than $10,000 for it. The difference between what you pay and what it's worth in 90 days is your interest. And you only get it after maturity. Right? Whoever owns it gets it. So they don't have any of these. It's not an annuity, in other words. There's no periodic coupon being paid.
They probably have really good interest too, don't they? I'd imagine.
They have very little interest. 90-day T-bills have almost zero interest rate right now. It's almost the same as holding cash.
Really?
Yeah, market rate of interest on 90-day T-bills right now is like 1.01 or something. You can look it up. Go to 100 different sites on. Well, because it is some return. What do you get when you hold cash? Nothing. Suppose you're saying why do people buy them? Here's why. What if you have $10 million? What if you have $10 million and you don't want to just hold in cash, do you? 90 days worth of interest on $10 million ain't chump change, even if it's just 1%. Right? And so that's why. Institutional buyers buy them mostly. You and I don't buy T-bills, do we? No, who does? Well, money managers do. Companies do. What does a company do with its cash on hand? It's not just lying around in the bank. They buy T-bills. Because T-bills are very liquid. You can sell them right now. So they're very near cash, aren't they? But while you own the T-bill, you're earning whatever rate of return you can get out of a T-bill. Well, the Fed has driven the short-term end of the yield curve to near zero. And of course, what happens to the high end of the yield curve when the Fed does that? Well, it tends to get drugged down with it. What happens to 10-year bonds when interest rates get drugged down? Their prices go up. Well, lucky you if you happen to own some long-term bonds when the Fed did that, right? Lucky you. Zeros have the greatest interest rate risk for the same maturity of any bonds because the duration is larger. I keep using this word duration. You don't know what that means, but just take it on faith that there is a calculation for duration. And with a zero, all of the payment comes at the end, right? You don't get any of it in advance periodically. And what that does is it increases what's called duration. Think of duration like this. Think of the balance point. If you had a series of cash flows strung out in time along my arm, here's today, here at my elbow is maturity. All right? And you cut it into whatever the periodicity is. Now think about big payments that live out here tip the balance down this way. Big payments that live up here tip it this way. All right? Now think of a physical balance point somewhere along there. And here would be zero duration, here would be zero duration, and then here's higher duration, right? As I move the duration higher, the balance point changes, right? And if I got a lot of payment hanging out here and I put the pivot point here, it really has an effect, doesn't it? Because there's this big payment out here. If the payments are distributed all along, then the balance point is going to be close to the middle of the maturity, isn't it? You see? Well, with a 0, where's all the payment? It lives out here. Right? So where's the balance point? It lives out here. Also, it's way out here. And since interest rates changing will have the most, a change in market rates of interest will have the most dramatic effect on a 0 for the same maturity. Well, 90 days isn't very long, so you don't get much change in the market value of a 90-day T-bill when interest rates change, because it's 90 days just isn't very long. But what if you had a 0 that was 10-year maturity? Oh my. Now, compared to another kind of bond that wasn't a 0, that had coupon payments, the price of a 10-year maturity 0 is going to change dramatically compared to the one that has periodic coupons when interest rates change, is what this is really saying here. So if you're a speculator and you actually believe you know which way interest rates are going, what kind of bonds would you want to use to speculate on? Long-term zeros, because you'll get the largest change in capital gain out of zeros. Okay? Now you know why people might want to strip interest rates away from, coupons away from long-term United States Treasuries. First of all, what are they doing? They're saying, well, I want a financial instrument that has one big payment at the end, but doesn't have any coupons. So they're saying, I want a 0. But then somebody else is saying, oh, I don't want a big payment at the end. I want semi-annual payments. So I'll take the interest. Okay, I'll sell you the rights to the interest to this treasury, this 10-year strip. You get the interest payments. I own the return of principal. Who would be interested in a deal like that? Somebody that wants to speculate on bonds. Right?
Who would cover the upfront?
Who covers what up front?
Like
a dealer. A dealer's got it. Somebody has to own the bond, right?
Yeah, who's going to pay that?
The dealer. The dealer buys the bond.
Dealer meaning?
And then he sells the strip. It's just like a car dealer. Like a car dealer goes and buys some cars and then he sells cars to people, right?
Okay.
A bond dealer goes and buys some bonds and then he sells some bonds to people. But in the case of strips, he sells the return of principal to one person and the coupons to another person. So he's creating a new sort of...
It's a 0 at a lower value, though, right?
Well, sure. I mean, if you strip away the coupon payments, sure, the present value of the $1,000 sitting out there 10 years from today is not as high as it would be with the coupons. So, yeah. All right, so bonds have interest rate risk. That's the risk that interest rates in the marketplace change, causing a change in the present value of bonds. That's a risk. They also carry credit risk, except for United States Treasuries. That's simply the risk that the borrower won't pay you. They default. They might promise to pay a particular bond, has a particular yield of maturity. So credit risk can be talked about in terms of the promised yield of maturity is greater than the expected yield of maturity, which means what? That means that the price of the bond gets bid down over its term. Investors will, of course, demand a default premium to compensate for them taking on credit risk. That's why if a company is doing a bond issue, let's suppose they've worked with an investment banker, they're doing a bond issue, and they've got everything set up, and they're ready to sell these bonds at $1,000 face value, carry a coupon of, let's just make up a number, let's say 4.5% coupon. All right, they're all set to go, and lo and behold, turns out it's Toyota, and it turns out the government just said, your accelerators are sticky. Now what? They won't be able to sell those bonds for $1,000. They'll have to sell them. They've got the whole deal set up, right? It's all in the works. They can't change anything except what? The market price can change. So you still got a bond that has $1,000 face value, still has a 4.5% coupon, but guess what? The day it's first sold, it's going to sell at a discount below $1,000 to begin with, which means its yield of maturity is higher, isn't it? So some of this terminology will take you time to think about it. It'll take maybe a long time. It turns out that bonds are the most complicated of all financial instruments. to really become conversant with the terminology and not have to stop and think when you heard somebody say something about a bond takes a while. And in fact, you can't get there unless you deal in bonds all the time. It has to be your daily. You just won't ever get to where you're just totally conversant with it unless it's what you do all the time. Okay, bond rating agencies like Standard & Poor's, Moody, and Fitch provide bond ratings that are intended to give some index or measure of the riskiness of one bond compared to another. As I mentioned to you, they haven't done a particularly good job with collateralized mortgage obligations, and they have been beaten up about it as they should have been.